Thank you, David. It's a real honor and privilege to be here. And I must say, I've spoken at many venues. As academics, you tend to do that. But I've never seen a venue and an audience that is this special. Really, last night, new friendships, new conversations. So deeply grateful to the organizers of this wonderful institution called the Camden Conferences. So you all deserve a round of applause to begin with. I was given this wonderful task of talking about India's post-colonial history in about 25 minutes. And at one level, the task is very easy. I could have simply used the word cricket and said, our history used to be, we love this game of intractable rules with no result. Now this is a game we are beginning to dominate. The Indian Premier League is becoming the most valuable sports franchise in the world. And there is India rising and shining. Post-colonial history done. But I'll resist the temptation because when we talk about cricket, it takes even longer than talking about Indian history. So what I want to do today is perhaps politically de-exoticize India a bit. We've de-exoticized India in the realm of culture. It's no longer just the land of snake charmers. Although we should not forget that snake charmers were there. I mean, we shouldn't lose sight of that extraordinary sort of aesthetic and other forms of cultural diversity. But there is still a temptation to say that India is like the snake charmer version of politics. We don't really understand it. This is a weird country. And of course, at one level it is. It confounds our expectations. The usual categories of analysis sometimes don't apply to India. In political science, there always used to be this one footnote in every book on democracy. Well, India is an exception. We were not going to talk about it for 50 years, right? And I think it's particularly important to de-exoticize India and try and think of it in familiar terms, in terms of problems that all of us as democracies are facing, including many of the kind of citizens in this room. India is like America in many ways. It's large. It's important and self-important. It has an acute sense of the power of its own example, like the United States thinks of its own example as creating a kind of world revolution in the history of democracy. So does India, actually, in some ways. The world's largest democracy, the mother of all democracies. And like the United States, its modern history is a clash between two different exceptionalisms. Right? On the one hand, like in the United States, there's a story about US exceptionalism, a country providentially endowed with liberty and the promise of liberation to mankind, yet also a country marked by racial hierarchy and violence. India, similarly, right? A country whose self-image, particularly in modern times, being driven by a sense of deep moral resources, perhaps an answer to the spiritual crisis of the world at the top of the Gangotri, right? And yet also a country marked by profound inequality and conflict. And we are at an interesting moment in Indian history because most countries, and at least large, important ones, usually have to navigate both of these exceptionalisms simultaneously. As somebody once put it, they have to be both flag bearers of their image and their highest aspirations. And they also have to be cross bearers for the injustices of their society. But at this moment in 2024, there is, I have to confess, an almost Goebbelsian pressure in India to actually, in some senses, simply talk about and be a flag bearer of India's self-image. It's almost crowding out any serious analytical, critical thinking about India. So how do we understand India at this moment? So let's begin with that self-image, because the self-image had a certain empowering quality to it. It was important. And like all self-images, it was founded on some truth, and an aspiration that was entirely admirable. India was one of the few post-colonial societies that self-consciously chose the path of democracy, even as early as the 20th century, where there's no precedent, right, for democracy succeeding in an unlettered, poor country. India chose that path, and it is remarkable how widespread that consensus was. India introduced universal suffrage at the lowest levels of income any country has, practically. And just to remind you, Switzerland had universal suffrage only as late as 1973. So in that sense, India is an astonishing country in the history of democracy, right? And India inverted the typical path of development. So the typical path of development was you kind of first build a nation, you reach a certain level of development, and then you, in a sense, politically liberalize and introduce democracy. India was this extraordinary experiment saying we are going to do it, both nation building and development, through democratic political negotiations. Right? Absolutely. I mean, it is like 1776 was one moment in the history of democracy, 1947 was another. Certain truth to that. Part of what came with democracy in India, and again, India stands out in the pantheon of post-colonial countries, was a genuinely anti-revolutionary impulse in its politics. Now, this has a good side and a bad side. The bad side of that genuinely anti-revolutionary impulse in India's politics was that there was a kind of faith in slow ameliorative change. Particularly change that would affect India's deeply inegalitarian and underperforming economic structure, and its most astonishingly vile and oppressive social structure, namely in terms of caste. Right? But unlike many countries of the post-colonial South, which had communist revolutions of various kinds, armed insurgencies, right? India self-consciously chose the path of an ameliorative response. And as I said, the bad side is that sometimes it was a bit too compromising with this historical legacy of inequity. But the plus side was that it generated a very self-conscious idiom, moral idiom about politics. Gandhi's insistence on nonviolence as being the central moral challenge for the 20th century, right? Even if you don't take it literally, even if you say, look, there may be circumstances, you can think of Nazi Germany, where such a council would be perhaps unsustainable or even foolish or perhaps even immoral. You could imagine those circumstances. But Gandhi's insistence that the means you deploy in politics will inevitably taint the ends you seek to pursue, right? And that there had to be a kind of moral and processual legitimacy to how you bring about social change, became part of India's self-understanding about how politics ought to be conducted, right? And as I said, at one level, it gave India a unique moral voice, an extraordinary experiment. On the other hand, sometimes it has to be said, this idiom also facilitated a certain conservatism about India's social institutions in past. And we will hear a lot about that for the rest of this program, so I won't go into that. Right. In 1950, India also adopts a constitution, a remarkable constitution, one of the longest constitutions in the world. And for all its marginal compromises, this was a liberal constitution in its aspiration. Why do I say liberal constitution? Obviously because it protected a whole series of liberal rights with some qualifications: free expression, freedom of association, freedom of trade, commerce, and so on and so forth, right? And I think the reason it's important to emphasize this choice India did not always live up to protecting these rights. We know in certain parts of India, particularly northeast, for a long time in Kashmir. But it is important to emphasize that it was a liberal constitution because there is a fashionable view going around that you can have something like illiberal democracy. Illiberal democracy is an oxymoron, and it's an oxymoron for two reasons. The constitutive rights that are central to liberal regimes, protection of individual dignity, freedom of expression, freedom of association, are also constitutive of democracy. And second, empirically, show me one regime that does not, if that regime assaults freedom of expression or freedom of association, it will not at some point try and subvert elections. So this bromide going around that somehow there's a kind of transitional moment, you either have liberal democracy or you don't. Okay? And this is one of the things I think we will be discussing in I think Ashu's paper. But the second most remarkable thing to me about the Indian Constitution and Indian exceptionalism was this wonderful little preamble to the Indian Constitution, which just talks about the dignity of the individual and liberty, equality, and fraternity. It's one of the few preambles in the world that is not burdened with God, identity, or history. Even the Chinese Communist Constitution begins with 5,000 years history of Chinese civilization as a reference point. Now, why did the Indian framers do that? They did not do it because they did not think God was not important. God knows they knew God was important, right? And particularly in a country like India. But because they had the moral imagination to understand that if God was genuinely important, God could not be confined and bottled up into a political identity. They did not begin self-consciously, although there are references, they talk about India's traditional name, Bharat. They were all self-conscious of India's deep civilizational roots. But they also knew those civilizational roots were sites of contention. And if you wanted to build a forward-looking republic, you did not have to burden it with those controversies of history. People will argue about it. Some people will think India is a tale of oppression, conflict. Others will think this has been a magical history of 1,000 years. Get on with it, right? And they did not burden it, most importantly, with a singular benchmarked identity. They did not burden with it because identity, while it's important to us as individuals, identity often is the biggest threat to freedom, right? We should be free to make whatever identities we want, choose whatever path conduces to our self-development. But if you have a political establishment that benchmarks India is a country for Hindus, or India is a country for X, or this is what it means to be Indian, it will automatically produce exclusion and conflict. So it was a profoundly deep engagement with the history of global politics that led them to this conclusion and gave India a certain kind of lightness, a lightness of being in some ways, right? That God, history, and identity actually are things that come out of our freedom. They need not burden our freedom. Now, and part of the interest at this moment is that this is the project that is actually in jeopardy. And I'll just talk about it for a couple of minutes in a second. The last and final thing I just want to put on the table as part of a story of Indian exceptionalism, but perhaps failed Indian exceptionalism. One of the remarkable things about the Indian nationalist movement, not just Gandhi, this is Tagore, Aurobindo Ghosh, Jawaharlal Nehru, any significant leader of the Indian national movement. They were all nationalists, they wanted self-determination for India, but they were deeply and acutely aware of what a crown of thorns the nation state is. Right? They had looked at European history, and they came to what is a striking conclusion, everywhere nation states have been formed, they have been formed through processes of violence, and most nation states have established their identity under the auspices of some kind of majoritarianism or dominant group, right? Later on, they liberalize, something like that. Every empire, when it has dissolved, whether it's the Habsburg, the Ottoman, and those territories convert themselves into nation states, they produce conflict, homogenization, and ethnic cleansing. No exceptions to this. The history of nation states, and that's one of the tragedies of modernity, right? It's the institutional form in which we exercise our democratic rights, it protects our rights, but it is also the institutional form that has produced some of the most deepest and violent conflicts in the world. Acutely aware of this consciousness, they tried an experiment. Can we think of a nation-state form, if you want to call it that has some of the advantages of a nation-state, a modern state with great state capacity, yet does not fall into the trap of that European and North American history that nation-states have fallen into? Now, I said it was a failed project because even by the 1930s, as the rifts between Hindus and Muslims grew over two particular issues. One, how is power going to be shared in this new democracy? And the conflict that emerged in the 1930s was a problem that came out of the process of democratization in some ways. That it's democracy that makes numbers important. Numbers make the question of majority versus minority important. How is power going to be shared? And emerging conflicts over how to represent the story of India's past. Because all nation states, in some senses, depend, or at least claim to depend on these stories. So the nationalist movement, and Gandhi was very acutely conscious of this, by the 1930s and certainly by the 1940s, as this tension begins to grow, thinks of that extraordinary project that they were trying to create as something of a failure. India was born under the shadow of partition, right? And the horrendous violence that followed, 1 million to 2 million killed, depending on which data you believe. Yet, what remained very distinctive about modern India's identity, again very distinctive in the pantheon of post-colonial states, is this extraordinary aspiration to find a politics that was free of resentment. Okay? Again, going back not just to Gandhi, but every single Indian modern thinker thought that if the power of India's example has to mean anything, it must be the search for an alternative, more authentic, and more sincerely lived universality. As Aurobindo Ghosh said, what would the point of independence be if we simply replaced colonial domination with some kind of collective narcissism and collective egoism, right? Even their engagement with the British was remarkably free of resentment. As Gandhi said, this is a common problem of civilization and modernity. Even colonialism, it's not the white man's problem. It is a problem of civilization and modernity that we have to, as a globe, as humanity, confront together. But the second and even more remarkable thing about this aspiration for a politics of resentment was a refusal to found a nation state on the politics of memory. There's a lot of talk these days about we have to look at India's history. As we know, what matters for nation states is not history but memory. History is about facts, right? In some ways, memory looks for facts that suit the objects of our recollection. Memory is about creating a community and identity, right? Memory is about taking facts from the past in a way in which you can take that identity forward. History is just about the past, right? One of the remarkable things about the Indian national movement was it tried to refuse the politics of memory. because it's realized that any foundation of the nation based on a politics of memory would be a politics of resentment. Nietzsche very rightly said, if you want to be free of resentment, the one thing you don't need is actually memory. By that, it doesn't imply you don't remember particular moral wrongs or right particular morals, but the idea is not to create boundaries through that act of memory. Right? One particular example, the ambassador referred to Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda visits Kashmir, and he is told about temples that have been destroyed by Muslim invaders. He's at this particular temple, Kheer Bhavani. It's the temple to goddess Kali and Shiva. It's a remarkable temple. And he starts weeping in the presence of the deity, saying, "Mother, how could you let this happen?" And he says, Mother came to him in a vision, Mother Kali, goddess Kali, and said, "Son, is it my job to protect you or your job to protect me? Move on." Right? Remarkable fact, actually, about how you can actually overcome a cycle of recrimination, resentment, and memory. Now, at this particular historical juncture, in 2024, I think the simplest way of describing this moment is India is overturning almost every facet of this grand experiment. Right? It is an electoral democracy still, but as I said, you can't be a genuine democracy if there is no freedom of expression, if freedom of association is curtailed, if the information order is controlled, if independent institutions kowtow to the executive. Professor Varshney is probably going to touch on some of these stuff with more data than I can. Right? And in part, this turning away is coming out of this sort of inchoate sense that somehow one of the things that has kept India backward is too much democracy. Right? India is the third largest country, is going to be the third largest economy in the world, but it is still below. It's what, 131 or something in the Human Development Index and per capita income, right? And any sensible leadership, as I said, would be both the flag bearer of our image and our aspiration, but also be the cross bearer of, in a sense, the burden of that injustice. There was a book written by an American journalist, Catherine Mayo, in the 1930s called Mother India, which was like, these days it reads like a cringe, scurrilous attack on India. I mean, just how awful India was and, sanitary conditions. And Gandhi's response to reading that book was, yes, this is a drain inspector's report, but every Indian should read it, right? Our current dispensation's response will be, if we can ban it, and even if we can ban those who read it, we'd be better off. So it's reneging on that promise of liberal democracy, but most profoundly, it is reneging on this extraordinary moral psychology that India's nationalist movement has bequeathed. When the Prime Minister inaugurated this temple at Ayodhya, which we talked about yesterday, he consistently says, this day is more important, or as important for India, as India's official Independence Day, August 15, 1947. Right? It is about taking a particular memory and taking it forward in a way which has no other objective but to marginalize India's plurality, marginalize India's Muslims. We can just go on and on about it. It's not just stopping at Ayodhya. Now there's a list of 4,000 monuments that the government and the ruling party wants to liberate. So in some ways, it is actually reneging on what was the most promising and grandest aspect of the modern Indian experiment. Now there's extraordinary things going on in India. India's economic dynamism is real. Unlike many critics of this government, I think its economic performance is not as great as it says, but it's not incompetent either. Mr. Modi is not Erdogan or Bolsonaro. Indian state capacity is expanding. India's technological prowess is expanding. So there is a kind of techno-modernism in which India will probably excel over the next decade or so. Great for the military-industrial complex in both our countries, right? It'll be extraordinary at that, no question about it. And yet you wonder whether this is also the moment. That's the real paradox we need to unravel. Why at this moment it is also a country becoming full of resentful hearts, small minds, and constricted souls. Thank you.